Welcome back to Take a Leap and Transform, a Neurodiversity journey. I'm your host, Joseph K. Muscat. Are you ready to take a leap with me? There is a continuous exploration and debate when we examine one type of neurodivergent or another, which is it genetic, behavior, or environment? Whenever we talk about genetics, it always falls into the medical model, meaning there is something wrong with you, i.e., it is a condition to be medicated and treated. Well, today we're going to dive into the discussion from a different perspective, one that has an opposite view and is more related to the social model. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Fredric Abramson, the founder of the Golden Thread. Fredric's life works focus on solving problems that relate to everyday life. He grew up in Philadelphia, went to public school, and wound up getting 5 degrees from schools like Michigan and MIT, with a PhD in human genetics and a mastery of management. As an early software developer, he did the first big data study in healthcare, which he analyzed 360,000 pregnancy outcomes to find that roughly 3 out of 4 pregnancies are miscarried, most early in pregnancy. He later did a public policy in alcohol abuse for the US government, worked in rock and roll performance arts and consumer businesses, and became a lawyer in his mid 40s so that he could help technology and health companies solve problems where the legal tally doesn't wag the business. Welcome, Dr. Fredric. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Joseph. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Fredric, I want to start with your personal history with being neurodivergent. As you are ADHD, could you share your lived experience with us?
Sure. Well, my path is clearly very nonlinear and not very logical. But in school, particularly in high school, I was very disruptive in class because I was always distracted by stuff. And the teachers found me to be a problem. So they actually took me out of the academic curriculum and put me into the commercial curriculum. So I learned typing, bookkeeping, and clerical practice. And they told me I'd never go to college, which obviously was not the best prediction they could have made. But because I was continually disruptive, they put me back into academics. And I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania, which is a shocker anyway. But given the theme of the talk, it's worth sharing something. Here's a high school graduate who has F's in his curriculum, has a total screw up in school, applies to an Ivy League school and gets in. Why would that be? Because the teachers who were watching me saw something in me on the other side of the disruptiveness that they thought was worthwhile. And so they let me go to Penn. So that has continued in my life. The one of the areas is that people have come into my life at the right time who, again, saw in me something beyond my ADHD and kind of disruptive mindset. They saw the broader picture of where my mind works. And so through that, I ended up going to graduate school and ended up at the University of Michigan and MIT. And basically, they saw my analytic side instead of my disruptive side.
That's really interesting. And it's really interesting because it gives a very generational look at the lens of how a child is being viewed through others who has ADHD. And what I want to ask here is just to give a little bit more perspective. Back in your youth, being seen disruptive, being pulled out of one study focus to another study focus, what was the viewpoint other than being disruptive that you were seeing growing or being treated by your peers and your teachers? And I've heard horror stories of horrible report cards being sent to parents in regards to such a child. What was that like?
Well, I had horrible report cards. And even as an undergraduate, I was on probation for 7 semesters in a row, which is an all-time record for the University of Pennsylvania. My undergraduate unadjusted GPA for including my failures is 1.65 out of 4. This is not exactly what you call a sterling performance as a student. But the thing I think that made a difference was that I was not afraid to speak up in class and to ask questions of the teacher and to put my hand up when they said, who wants to see how this problem gets solved? And I'd be right up there. And they would call on me. And so I would be able to offer my thoughts. And I would ask questions. Other students would tell me to shut up. I'm disrupting the class. But I explained how this worked. But I think it also was, Joseph, the luck of having teachers who saw beyond the moment and saw something in me. And the best way to illustrate it was the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, who, when I wanted to go to graduate school, the chairman of biology called me into his office and said, and I think this bears directly on your question, he said, so you want to go to graduate school? I said, yes, I don't want to go to Vietnam. He said, okay, good point. He said, we're going to recommend you because we've been watching you. And I go, what? What's that mean? He said, you will make a statement in class that our best graduate students won't understand. And 5 minutes later, you make a statement in class that is so cosmically stupid, we don't understand how the same person could make both statements. But it's the first one that counts. So we're recommending you. I think that that's an attitude, Joseph, that says, look beyond the moment and see something about the person that isn't in his or her actual momentary behavior. And I think that theme has been through my whole life, that people have looked at me as a person beyond a particular behavior, which in some settings is considered to be negative. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And it just highlights the importance of understanding the individual, understanding and how they think, and spotting those key moments where those strengths really shine, rather than looking at the negative behavior that doesn't conform to what they prefer.
And I would add one other thing. Again, the luck of the draw. The people who were my faculty or whatever, were always willing to challenge me as well. They would always offer me projects that they wouldn't offer other students to see how I would do because they saw my analytic ability from being in class. And so, in fact, that's how I got my PhD, because here I am, a graduate student in population planning at the University of Michigan, analyzing contraceptive programs in Pakistan and India. And one of the visiting faculty, an OBGYN from Sweden, Gunnar Yerstam, calls me into his office and says, I would like you to read all of the publications, all the science on spontaneous abortion and tell me what they say. Now, that's a big task to ask somebody, right?
Mm.
So I read all the papers, about 50 of them. And I come back and I say, Gunnar, I've got good news and bad news. He said, what's the good news? I said, they all say it's 25%. He said, what's the bad news? I said, they're all full of shit. Their methodologies are terrible. And then he asked the fateful question, can you solve the problem? And I said, yes, if I got the data. So the second part of that story, Joseph, is that serendipity, you've heard the term serendipity, right?
Yes.
That sometimes things happen and you have no control over them, but it opens a door for you and it's an opportunity to go through. And I think it's a message for people who, like me, who have a challenge in certain areas. I discovered that the city of New York requires reporting of all pregnancy outcomes by physicians, regardless of when the pregnancy is known. And so I sent a letter to the Commissioner of Health, Carl Earhart. Dear Dr. Earhart, I'm a graduate student at the University of Michigan. Please send me copies of your 1963 and 1965 vital records. Now, I didn't know, Joseph, at the time. It was illegal for me to have them. This is a case where ignorance sometimes pays off. So you imagine this head of the health department getting this letter from a student, right? And you know what his reaction is going to be. There's no way in hell he gets his data. But he's the commissioner, and I didn't figure this out until I was at MIT in the business school. You walk out from you don't type your own letters, not in the 60s and 70s. You have a secretary. So I know he walked out and took the letter and threw it on the secretary's desk and said, take care of this, meaning send him a letter that he can't have the data. But she misinterpreted what he meant. And she calls the computer center and says, the commissioner wants you to send this guy the data. And I got a call saying, send us tapes and you get the data. So I ended up with all this data because of a screw up internally. Sometimes the cosmos, Joseph, is not organized along parallel lines. Mm. And I think from the purpose of your audience, sometimes things happen and you have to take an action in that dimension to move on it because it's an opportunity that may never come again. And that's what happened to me several times. And I acted on it and it worked out. But I think it's an empowering message not to feel defeated by the negative messaging, because that was something I never felt bad. I never saw myself as being less than someone else. Different, yes, but less than, no. And maybe that's an empowering message for people who are dealing with the subject of differences like ADHD and autism and so on.
Well, that's a very powerful message. And thank you for sharing the story, because it really explicits the point that you're trying to make here. Now, Fredric, what led you into genetics? Because you've taken a very different turn from where you initially started.
The cosmos, as I said, is organized in interesting ways. So when I was at Michigan, I was doing computer programming and analytics for population planning. But I would go to the seminar in human genetics because my then wife, Ruth, was a student in human genetics. So I'd go to the seminars to learn, because learning is something that is really interesting to me personally. And one day, the chairman of the Department of Human Genetics, Jim Neal, who's really the founder of human genetics in the world, he discovered sickle cell anemia. And Michigan came to him and said, start a Department of Human Genetics because this is the future. So he came to me one day after a seminar and said, why do you come to these? I said, because Ruth is here and these are interesting. He said, how would you like to give a seminar? I said, okay. He said, do it on the ABO blood groups of the American Indians. Okay. So I do the reading, including ABO blood groups in Switzerland, and I give my seminar and talk about how different populations have different levels of ABO, even though they're close together, which means they're not interbreeding. They're not marrying each other or breeding.
If I may just pause you there for a moment, can you explain what ABO is?
Oh, it's the blood group distribution. You have type A blood, type B blood, and type O blood. And it's one of the earliest classifications of blood types. Blood type is a genetic thing. And so your blood type is defined by your genetics.
Okay.
No, it's a great question, and I appreciate asking that. So when I finished my seminar and answered questions, he came up to me with the population planning professor and said, how would you like to be a student? I said, okay, why not? And then I got to be a student, and that got me into my my thesis topic because it was a population topic. But the key element that I carried with me, and this is something that Professor Neal kept saying over and over again, is genetics will make life better. Genetics will open the opportunity for people to understand who they are and to be able to make decisions about who they are in a way we've never thought about before. And that message stayed with me. But it was really just my being interested in the area, going to seminars, being asked to do something, doing it, and they liked the performance and they said, here, become a student.
Now let's build on that, because you've built a foundation for where we're going. About genetics is about defining who we are. So what does then the medical model get wrong in regards to genetics and who we are?
That's a wonderful question. And I saw it evolve over time. Again, going back to my time at Michigan with Jim Neal, who, that was what they were studying, disease, because in the 60s and 70s, there was very little known in medicine about some of the big chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease, whatever. So the focus continued to be on understanding the disease process. But Neal's message of making life better got lost, in my opinion, in the fact that the funding for research in the academic world comes from government and foundations. And the government tended to want to focus on disease. The National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, Heart, Lung, and Blood, whatever it is about disease. And so the money captured the mind of the researchers and moved it into disease. And that was a focus driven by, that's where our opportunity to do research is. And I never was attracted to that because I had the public health side of it in looking at normal behaviors, helping people understand who they were from a nutritional point of view, contraception. These are everyday things. And have I answered your question, Joseph?
You have absolutely. And you mentioned in regards to building on who we are and behavior, and the medical model misses the aspect of behavior. So
Yeah.
what do you think, what do you see as the link between genetics and behavior?
Well, I think that everything we are, everything we do has a genetic component and an environmental component. We learn from what we do. I learned over my lifetime. I continue to learn. I'm learning now. You're doing a podcast. This is not one of my routine experiences. So this is a dynamic that I'm learning from. But still, at my core, I am a genetic creature, and the genes don't change. They're an input into who I am. And I think that the problem has been in the medical world is they hyper focus on inputs that relate to bad outcomes. And the two things I will share with you about bad outcomes, one of which was an aha moment for me, and the other has to do with 2023 and the mindset of people. Over the years, I've talked to many, many women about whether they would want to get tested for the BRCA gene for breast cancer. And I've talked to women even who have breast cancer in their family. And what I discovered is that only 1 in 10 women that I talk to, if I say, okay, Susan, we've had a great discussion for 15 minutes. Would you want to be tested for the breast cancer gene? And only 1 in 10 say yes. And when I ask the other 9, why not? The answer is almost always the same. If I'm positive, it means I worry for the next 20 years, or I cut my breasts off. Neither one are choices I like. Very pragmatic. Now, the other thing that I share that has to do with the missing the boat is that in the world at large, there is a perception that disease is really the thing we have to worry about. And you look at even today, the publications that come out in August, the emails, heart disease continues despite dietary changes. We have to have people eat the right foods. Yeah, and it's all this noise in the system. In the meantime, nothing's changing. We still have the same level of heart disease. We still have the increasing level of obesity. But I will share with you, which the statement made to me, which opened my eyes big time to changing the focus from disease entirely to everyday life, was a statement made to me by the CEO of Philip Morris, the cigarette company, in 1976 in a meeting with the MIT Sloans when he learned I was in the healthcare field. And he pointed his finger at me when I was going to ask a question. And I said, "Stop right there. Do you know what the problem with the American people is?" And I shook my head, no. He said, "They want to die healthy." And I thought, that to me is the best statement anyone's ever made about healthcare and medicine. It wants to tell us how to die healthy, not how to live well. And I went, wrong focus. We live in the real world. We live in a world where it's August 15th, well, 16th now in some parts of the world. And people get up in the morning and they say, how's my life going to be today? What can I do to make life better today for myself, for my significant others, for my kids? Why aren't we focusing on that? And the science is there to do that.
You mentioned hyper-focus on the bad inputs.
Right.
And hyper-focusing on the bad outcomes. So
right.
what is defined as the bad inputs to get to the bad outcomes?
I think most of the literature would argue and say it's a combination of your genetics and your environment. The genetics tends to be more of, in the research, the predictive stuff. Like, you're more likely to get heart disease or, cancer or diabetes, whatever it is. They look for a single gene that links to a disease. And for what it's worth, for the audience, my older daughter, Stephanie, with my first wife, Ruth, has a genetic condition called Marfan syndrome, which is a single gene disorder affecting the collagen. And it means that she is taller than most people. If she can have a dissection of the aorta, because it has to do with the cross fibers aren't there the same way. It affects vision. She's 51 years old, has 2 kids of her own, one of whom has also Marfan's. So I know what it is to grow up with a genetic condition, and it's significant. But the fact is, not many people have as a starting point in their life a genetic condition. So the other point is, how does environment and genes interact, right? And this is where the geneticists are just flailing around, in my opinion. But it turns out that the environment is the most powerful input you have after your genome. And I gave the example I would use for people is to understand is there's a genetic condition called Huntington's disease, which is a single gene disorder, one gene. It starts in your late 40s, early 50s. It's a neurologic disorder. When it starts, your path to the end is pretty quick. It's over. In the old days of genetics, which is like last year, if you and I were identical twins, Joseph, and you were diagnosed today, Tuesday, as having the gene for Huntington's, I'd be diagnosed on Wednesday because we're identical. Ruth, my ex-wife, the mother of Stephanie, the daughter with Marfan's, is an expert on Huntington's. And she studied identical twins and discovered the age of onset could vary up to 8 years. That's huge. Now, she doesn't know what environmental factors shifted the curve. That's a whole other research project. But the mere fact that you can take a condition that has one gene to trigger the onset and shift the date of onset up to 8 years is extraordinary. So the answer is it's really always the environment combined with the genes. But the problem is we're not spending enough time looking at that linkage more precisely. We're still guessing about don't eat a lot of dietary fat or don't eat sugar. It's not the same stuff that we've had the last 30 years, and it isn't making a difference.
So what you're saying then, because you've kind of answered the next question. What you're saying though is when we take a look at what role that the environment plays into behavior and genetics, what you're saying is that we haven't really looked enough into understanding and studying the environment to understand the actual impact it has on both genetics and behavior.
That's the huge research hole, absolutely. And an example which I think I've shared with you that shows how interesting that interaction is in a positive way is the trait called perfect pitch in music. Being able to hear musical notes, absolutely. That is pretty rare in the population. I think it's like 1 in 10,000 people have it's a genetic trait. 1 in 10,000 people have the gene, but 20% of professional musicians have it. But here's the cool thing. If you're born with the gene and you're not exposed to music in the first 8 years of your life, you never develop the trait of perfect pitch. The gene basically goes to sleep and stays asleep for the rest of your life. That to me is a great example of the environment. Who would think that music is an important thing to give a kid with the possibility that they may become a musician with talent? It isn't obvious, but a lot of stuff isn't obvious when we relate genetics to how our lives are. And that's why it isn't studied very much, Joseph.
Yeah, and it also points out the aspect of how the pivotal role that the environment plays into triggering and shaping that gene, that behavior, and potentially the outcome of that individual's life.
That's absolutely correct. And the other addition is having a gene is not a fait accompli. It's not if X, then Y. And I think there's some good examples of if you know something about your genetic inputs to normal things, you can adjust what you do if the normal thing doesn't match what you'd like to see happen. And one of the gene variants, two examples that I like to use are there's a gene variant for being shy. Now, being shy is also learned. They teach kids not to be aggressive in groups and whatever.
Right.
But when I tested this out a few years ago, a woman who genetically had the gene for shyness said, "Oh my God, I didn't learn this. It's built into me. I'm going to figure out how to overcome this." And so what she did is she would go to meetings, and instead of going in the meeting and standing in the corner, waiting for people to discover her, she would stand in the doorway and say, "Hi, I'm Susan. I'm glad to meet you." And she got to meet everybody coming into the meeting one-on-one. She's still shy, but she overcame it. How about the gene from not learning from mistakes? In kids, if you make a mistake and you don't learn from it, the way a lot of people, teachers and parents, would say is, "Michael, that was dumb. Why'd you do that?" Well, if you don't learn from mistakes, you're going to repeat it. So if you know your kid doesn't learn from mistakes, it's, "Michael, here's the better way to do it." And then go to the teacher and say, "Michael is not stupid. When he makes a mistake, he'll repeat the mistake." You have to teach him how to overcome the mistake. This is where the gene is there. It's having its role. It's doing its work. But the work it's doing is not fitting in to the big picture of making life better, okay? So the way you make life better is, now that I know this gene is there, what can I adjust in my environment to overcome the way that gene is working? Shyness, learning from mistakes. How another gene, risk-taking behavior. Do you ever know anybody when you were growing up who just was over the top taking risks out in the schoolyard and did some of the dumbest things you ever saw? Right. Well, it turns out there's actually a gene for being a risk taker. So doing that, sometimes as a genetic input, you're more likely to have bad things happen to you. And the great example of how your genetics provides insight, a woman in her late 30s living in the UK suffered a major ACL tear in her knee as a downhill skier when she was 19 years old. It was so severe, she's still having surgery from that injury 20 years ago. But when she discovered, when she sent me a copy of her DNA profile, that she had the gene for risk taking, her answer, and that's why I was a great downhill skier, and that's why I hurt my knee. I took one risk too many. And the two things always go together. And all I'm suggesting to your audience is if you know something about who you are in the normal spectrum of your life, you can have an impact on decisions you make to make your life better in a way up till now you're only guessing at.
Let's take a pause here because I want to share with you not one, but two workshops I've put together to bring awareness and to uplevel the skills of employers, managers, and human resources. The first workshop aids in building a more inclusive environment in the workplace for neurodivergent talent and in developing the skills of management to be more engaging with their teams. I geared the second workshop towards examining and providing practical solutions and how to be more inclusive to neurodivergent talent in the recruitment process. Reach out to me on my website to learn more about these amazing programs. This is really interesting because it brings in the argument of nature versus nurture. And
Yes.
the reality is there is no argument. It's a combination of both.
The word versus is such a misleading term. It's as if the two are in combat with each other. It's both. And which one can we control? It's the nurture part. And we can't control every bit of it. I mean, 2 months ago, we had bad air in the Washington, D.C. area from wildfires and fires in Canada. Well, I can't do a whole lot with the air I'm breathing. Yeah, I can wear a mask, but let's be realistic. But we can control a lot of our environment. We can choose where we want to be. We can choose how we interact with people. We can choose who we want to associate with. We can choose where we want to live, how we want to do our everyday things. We can choose what we eat. Why not make those choices with a little more sense and awareness and eliminate some guessing? One of the big problems, and this to me is a huge issue, and the word huge is kind of a spontaneous metaphor. Everywhere in the world, weight management has become a problem. Obesity is increasing. It's increasing throughout the third world because food is available 24/7. Morbid obesity is bad. Okay. I mean, if you're 40 pounds, 50 pounds overweight, you are definitely going to have health problems in your future and a shortened life. Well, what's the model that people use to have you lose weight? Well, the reason you're obese is you're uneducated, you're indifferent, you're lazy, and you're stupid. Well, those are great messages, very empowering. But suppose someone told you that you have a gene that has you eat more sugar than other people. You can go, oh my God, I think I can maybe deal with that. Or maybe you love sugar and you learned to eat it, but you don't have the gene for that. You say, oh my God, I learned to eat sugar as a compensation for how I was brought up as a kid. I'm still in charge. I can change my diet. Knowledge provides insight and power to the individual. And that's what we're talking about in the divergent world, is to have power to the individual, to fit in, to understand who we are, understand where we are, and to have more control over our life so that other people can collaborate with us on more reasonable terms. That makes sense, Joseph?
It makes absolute sense. And what brings us into a bigger picture is as you stated, bringing the awareness to understanding how one's behavior and understanding how one reacts to another's behavior impacts and shapes their lives. But there's a missing element in not understanding, and in regards to the genetic side, of having a better understanding of the genetics to be able to adapt and potentially shape that behavior towards that genetics. And it's interesting because I just recently read an article this morning that just came out in regards to the neurodivergent community, in particular ADHD. In the UK, the study has found that over 80% of people have a underlying genetic condition that they are unaware of. So over 80% of the population is in some way potentially having one neurodivergent or another, or a combination of both. And it's about bringing the awareness of if we have this understanding that 80% of the population is potentially having an underlying neurodivergent condition, then what are we going to do to create a better environment and a better behavior to shape and help guide that genetic aspect? And what we're talking about here basically comes down to the social model versus the medical model, creating the right environments and the right behaviors that will help support and strengthen that individual's particular neurodivergency.
And I think you're right touching on the social model. I kind of believe that most of the really big changes that come from a kind of social guerrilla warfare. They don't come because the people at the top have planned it out. And I think one of the best examples is this. In the 80s and 90s, the computer people didn't think this would ever become anything. They thought, what? Why would anybody want to carry a phone in their pocket? Duh. But you're absolutely right. I think the fact that genetic testing is now available around the world to people on an individual basis without having to have a medical person involved is a form of empowerment. Now, the challenge is, how do you know how to interpret what the results are? And most of the work in even the companies who are doing it, and Golden Thread is launching in that area as well. It focuses a lot on, here's your genetic information, and I'll give you a report, and I'll tell you the pluses and minuses, and I'll see you next month. The report is the end of the game. I learned that telling people all the stuff doesn't change behavior. Hasn't changed it with dealing with obesity, hasn't changed it with lifestyle changes that relate to cardiac. Reports don't matter. What matters is creating a dynamic environment where you as a user can say, I'm faced with this decision this afternoon, this evening, and I'd like more insight, like on where should I go for dinner, given my genetic makeup and given some other things that I know about myself, like my age, my health condition, so on. Why shouldn't you be able to put it into your phone and have some suggestions on, well, today's not your day for Mexican, today's your day for Turkish food? To me, that's the way we have to go. So, yeah, I think that the power lies in the population who is dealing with the reality of problems. And I want to share another story to kind of make the point of the difference between the policy people and the people who are telling us all the shoulds, and the people who are living our lives every day. Again, going to weight loss. I was part of the Federal Trade Commission, U.S. Federal Trade Commission's Consumer Weight Loss Coalition in the late 90s. And we would meet in D.C. and they would tell us all the bad things that are happening. And the message they had was, if you don't listen to me today, your risk of dying of heart disease is going to go up. And if you're not paying attention to me, there's something wrong with you. And they said that in those days, still probably true, 4 out of 5 people on a weight loss plan are women. They said men tend not to want to lose weight unless they survive the first heart attack. And I quipped that if they don't survive the first heart attack, it's permanent weight loss, but nobody cares. The other thing they said, and the statistics are these: out of every 100 overweight people, 20 don't care. 60 have given up, and that's really important. 60 have given up, and the other 20, one will lose weight and keep it off for a year. That's 1 out of 100, Joseph. Well, I worked for a company that was in weight loss, so I went up to New York to talk to people in the center, most of whom were women. And I'd be talking to them, just like you and I are talking. And I'd say, finally, so, Susan, why are you here? The number one reason these women said to me, eyeball to eyeball, I don't want my husband to screw around on me. The number 2 reason, I get tired walking up and down the steps. Number 3 was, I'd like to look like I did 20 years ago. And once in a while, somebody said, I worry about heart disease and cancer. And I said, that's the message. People live in the here and now. They want to know what to do today to make life better, not tomorrow, not next month, not next year. And this is where I see the promise of genetics, Joseph. If we look at the genes that affect everyday life, and we have 20,000 of the little guys in our body, most of which we're still trying to figure out. We can understand who we are.
I mean, there's a couple of things here that I really like, and I just highlight. I like the point that you stated, the social guerrilla warfare. That's a very interesting observation and statement. And it's also interesting in the analogy that you gave in regards to weight loss. It reminded me in regards to when we talk about the here and now, it relates to ADHD, because in the ADHD, when we take a look at the incentive behavior, if it's too far away, the goal, the reward, ADHDers will tend to lose focus and focus on other things. We need to bring the goal much more closer and to chunk that behavior so that the rewards are more immediate than too far away. And it's very interesting in that analogy how we relate this into regards to behavior versus genetics, or not even versus, shaping the behavior to adapt to the genetics of a neurodivergent individual. So with that observation, I want to bring the focus back towards neurodiversity. We have seen through studies how genetics play a role in various neurodivergent conditions such as dyslexia, autism, and ADHD. And of course, we've seen this through the medical model, as we have highlighted through this discussion. Based on what we've chatted about, what can you add? How can you relate your understanding toward neurodiversity?
It's a wonderful question, Joseph. I think I want to go back a little bit to what I heard you describe about the here and now. I think, and ADHD, looking at the future for outcomes, and I was thinking back to my earlier days, the rewards, and I'll use the word punishment, for my behavior were almost always immediate. The teachers basically said, that was really good. So I was getting the feedback in real time that allowed me to continue doing things. And if they said that really was not something they wanted to see, it didn't stop me because I was getting the other rewards, the positive one. And I think that's a crucial point, that we have to focus on the here and now. And I think for the neurodivergence, I mean, I have two granddaughters who are both autistic. The older one is more high-level autism. And the Montgomery County Public Schools has programs for her to help her focus her behavior. But I'm seeing her becoming more social. She just went to a 2-week overnight camp, and she had a blast. She loved it because everything was in the here and now. Everything she did was about today. So her rewards were immediate. Her learning was immediate. And I think at that point you make is really critical. Yeah, it's not perfect. If you're disruptive, you have to be told you're being disruptive, because it's okay to be called out on it, but not called out on it in a way that makes you inherently a bad person. But the behavior you're doing right this moment isn't working. Again, you go to sports. The way to adjust a young kid's playing on the field is you say, here's what you did. Here's a way to do it better. Your coaching is immediate. You don't tell them, next month, I'm going to show you how to catch a ball and throw it to first base. Who cares? I don't know if I've answered your question.
You did. And that's a very interesting analogy in regards to the coaching, because when we take a look at the education system, or we take a look in the workplace, the focus is more on the negative. This is what you did wrong. This is the critical, which is really what it is. It's critical, constructive criticism. And that criticism can have a very negative effect, particularly on a neurodivergent child who is being told on a consistent basis of their particular problems. And of course, that becomes even more so when it's in the workplace. When we take a look at coaching, again, the coaching is being aware of their behavior and the impact of their behavior, of what they say and what they do towards the person that they're coaching. Here's what you did. Here's a different way of how to do it better. And then building upon that to get the person to achieve the goals and the rewards that both parties are trying to achieve.
That's really important, Joseph. And I would add one more element from my work in the business world as a coach in corporations, which is that, the phrase they use is now active listening. What I have observed, and it still goes on, is that we don't spend enough time letting, I don't spend enough time letting you know that I heard what you were telling me on terms that make it understandable before I tell you what I think of what I heard you say. I'm more inclined to say, why'd you say that, Joseph? That was dumb, as opposed to, Joseph, so here's what I'm hearing you say, and here's why I see your approaches. I understand it. Am I correct? And if the answer is yes, well, here's my feedback on what I'm hearing you say. Now, I've just changed the loop from one of, here's the instant acts, to at least you know that I was paying attention to what you were doing. Now I can give you feedback. That makes sense to you?
Well, it makes complete sense. As one of the things I talk about in my consultancy is about proper communication, and how to be active listening and to encourage questions, because that's giving time to process and allowing that person to give the particular feedback in regards whether they understood, and that way you can give the feedback in regards to saying yes or no. This is how to move forward in that regards. Now, let's come back though, because we want to relate the aspect, and we have been talking about this in various different formats, but let's relate this in regards to neurodiversity. When we talk about genes and behavior, so based on what we talked about so far, how does the aspect of genetics and behavior play into neurodiversity? Because we know that there are genes for ADHD, we know there are genes for autism and dyslexia. So how does that come into play in particular relationship to understanding and shaping behavior towards the genes?
Well, I think I would go broader than that, Joseph. And I think that I would say the genetic input into any neurodivergent issue is there. That's who it is. Okay. Whether it's autism, ADHD, whatever. But those are kind of singularities in my mind. But we've got this whole genome that is basically dynamically interacting with their environment. And it's the rest of the stuff that will let us understand what we can do proactively as an individual with a issue, or with being around an individual with an issue. Two different pieces. But going back to the things we talked about earlier, if you're autistic and you're 8 years old and you have the gene for being shy, you now kind of have a double whammy in terms of how you interact with people. But if I, as the adult, parent, whatever, know that you're also shy, I can say, let's structure interactions with people so that you can learn the skills of social communication in a more useful way, so that your shyness doesn't get in the way of adjusting to your autism. This goes to everything. If we tend to be reductionist in our thinking, if we tend to want to reduce it down to the gene or the genes related to X, we will be duplicating what the medical community is doing and why they're missing the boat. They're standing on the shore yelling why people aren't paying attention to them about disease, and the boat is out there sailing away because life is bigger than a single gene. And so from my perspective, I would say the more we know about ourselves as an adult, or the people around us who are neurodivergent, the more we know about their genetic portfolio in total, the more we understand how to help people fit in and shape their behaviors to fit in, so that we have the right work environment and the right social environment.
That's a really great answer, and it gives a very clear picture and understanding of the message that you're giving. What I would change in that aspect though is it's not the fitting in. There's a term known as cultural add. You're adding to the current environment and letting people be who they are based on how they think and process. Because part of the problem is that we're constantly expecting neurodivergence to fit into the social norm rather than getting the social norm to recognize and to accept the cultural add point of view, which is again based on their behavior, their genetics, and the environment of who they are.
I appreciate the clarification. When I used the term fitting in, I was not meaning to imply adjusting to a social norm, which is arbitrary. What I meant was feeling part of the coherent whole and being part of the team, but still on your own terms, but still part of the team. No, I agree. Forcing people to adapt to a social norm that's arbitrary, it goes beyond the specifics of what we're talking about. It's counterproductive.
Thank you for that clarification because I understand exactly what you mean by the fitting in. It's a different of terminologies, but
Yeah, it is.
with the same message, right?
But that's the problem with English. The same words can end up meaning different things. But I come out of a team environment, and as a ball player, I was a ball player when I was a younger, and when I was at Michigan, we had 15 guys who played ball together every weekend, all year round. And if somebody came out to play with us, we only asked ourselves one thing: how do you fit into the team as a whole on your terms? And if you said, I'm too good to not play by your rules, then you're off the team. But if you played your own way, but as part of the whole, knock yourself out, babe. That's what being on a team is about.
Now, Fredric, one of the challenges of society, and particularly potentially one can say it's its failings, is where we're not a needs-based focus and we're more of a function-based focus.
Yes.
The misunderstanding that society fails to recognize is that you need to be supporting the needs to improve function. Based on what you've shared with us, Fredric, how can we apply genetics to support the needs to improve function?
I think going back to the core, if we understand the panoply of genetic inputs to ourselves and to people around us, our children, we can make adjustments that match needs that have a rationality to them, that are less arbitrary. So let's go back to the example of shyness. The woman who decided to stand in the doorway to greet people was solving a need, right? She wanted to connect with people, but she didn't know how. So genetics gave her a clue on how to make the adjustment. The woman who discovered that she didn't have the gene for eating sugar, but she learned, but when she was a kid, her house, they didn't let her eat sugar when she was growing up. So she learned that she was eating sugar as a compensation for what she was doing as a growing up. Her need was to lose weight. Her genetic information said, wow, I'm not wired to eat sugar. I'm allowed to change what I eat. Genetics adds a dimension. It isn't absolute truth. It isn't ultimate truth. It's simply adding more dots to the picture, the 19th century mosaic that the Impressionist artists did, in which they used dots to create the picture. The genome is simply a set of dots that when we know what the color is and we know what their environment is, that we can begin adjusting things to fit needs. And the needs are both personal, group, and societal, but they're all there. That's my view.
Thank you for that. Now, I want to move this towards the workplace.
Okay.
And how we can apply this in in that environment. In relation to neurodivergent individuals and how employers, human resources, and managers can understand genetics and apply this to the workplace to create a better employee experience and improve performance. How can genetics be applied in that area?
That's a wonderful question. And I see it from the point of view of empowering the individual, not the system. And this goes back to my work in public health and contraceptives. Using a contraceptive is a personal decision. The purpose is to prevent pregnancy and in some cases avoid disease. The consequences of those personal decisions at the group level, institutional level, has a social consequence in birth rates, unplanned pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, yada, yada, yada. But the fact is, it all comes down to the individual person who's engaging in a sexual act and has a choice in how to whether and how to use contraception. I see genetics and particularly from my point of view, wellness genetics through that same lens. I want to give you the power to adjust your behavior in ways that make sense to you so that your path in life today and generally is more in your control. Now, that control may be I want to be better fitted into my work environment. I want to be able to do more productivity in my job, whatever that is. Or it may be maybe I need to move to a different environment. Maybe I need to go back to school. Maybe I have to study something different. I want to empower you to make the choice. I don't want people, and this is me personally, in HR or some manager above me telling me what they think I should do based on my genes. That is unilateral advice. It doesn't work. It's almost always based on a bias of this person telling me. My company, Golden Thread, I get asked all the time, what advice do I plan to give people? I say, I'm never going to give you advice because advice is always Fredric speaking. I want you to be able to make a decision on what you need to do in control of your life in terms that you can make sense of. This is the power. So if the individual employee can look at their genome and their kid's genome and their significant other's genome, because we don't live in a bubble. Years ago, when I was at Michigan, one of the people on my committee was from the Institute for Survey Research, and they did a massive study of happiness. Okay. And they studied whether happiness is better place in the workplace or at home. And what they found was that happiness doesn't matter where you get it. The more happier you are, the better you are. And it didn't matter whether it comes at home or in work, just be happier. And I think that that's a message which carries with me. If I can give you control over your life today, by having you understand your genetics or your kids. If I can have you as a parent of an 8-year-old understand that your child needs more vitamin K in their diet so that when they fall down in the playground, they don't break their arm, you're going to say, oh, you've made my day. You've given me the power to do something in my kid's diet that protects them from something bad, like a broken bone. Happiness is where we find it. I want to empower you to control it.
So with that said, Fredric, to empower the individual to understand their genome and their genetic mapping, which we've talked about in the prep talk, how can one go about in requiring their genetic map?
I don't know that I would ever require anybody to get their genetic map. In fact, one of my business plan elements is to go to companies who are self-insured and tell them that if your employees do a genetic analysis for these wellness genes, the insights they get over their behaviors, their ability to control their weight, how they eat, how they interact, is improved, which will have an impact on your bottom line. I'm talking with people who are dealing with substance abuse, how to recover from substance abuse. Well, this opens up a whole new door, a window, if you will, to say, how am I different? How can I learn from that? So, the answer is we need to be able to give people the opportunity to see this the world this way, but I don't want to ever force anybody to do it. You have to want to say, it's my choice. And the first choice is, I want to learn something about who I am so I can begin making smarter choices about my life every day. I hope that answers your question.
It does. And if they make that choice and they go through this genetic analysis, what markers should they be looking for then to understand and to change their behavior environments towards whatever particular genetic identification pops up out of that choice of understanding their genetics?
That's a great question, Joseph. And I'd say the literature is massive. And so I don't want to be the one in a position to say, pick learning from mistakes versus risk taking versus shyness. What I would say, every genetic variant that's been identified is given an identification number that begins with the letters R as in Robert, S as in Sam, RS. And they're called single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs. So if you wanted to Google a SNP, SNP, for RS 571312, you would get a bunch of hits and it would tell you about that gene variant and research on it. And then you would understand from the test where you are in terms of whether you are a dominant gene or the recessive gene and which genotype you are. And for every gene, there are only 3 genotypes: major, minor, and the combined heterozygous. You could dive into the literature on your own. Google will tell us what to do. Is it easy to read? I won't pretend it's something that's as easy as reading a Captain Marvel comic book, okay? But right now, aside from Golden Thread and maybe 1 or 2 other companies that are starting to emerge, people aren't out there looking at the big picture of how our normal wellness genetics makeup interacts with our world in a meaningful way. So you rely on Google. You could even use Chat GPT and ask it, what effect does this gene have on me? And it will probably tell you stuff. It's an open world, Joseph. It's waiting to be put into a rational basis that everyone can use. It's the tip of the iceberg. The one caution I would give, having made that statement, is do not run full storm into it without paying attention, because like the Titanic, you could sink yourself.
That's pretty much with everything. If you go too much the wrong way in understanding particular things. But that's really interesting because it goes back to what we clarified at the beginning, right? Which is understanding the environment, understanding the behavior, to understand the gene that you may potentially classify with, and being able to adapt that behavior environment to bring the changes in your life that you hope to achieve by having that awareness understanding, which relates a lot again to understanding neurodivergence, right? When you have a proper understanding of your dyslexia, your ADHD, and knowing how to come up with the proper strategies, the proper environments, and to be able to have the language to speak about it effectively will have an impact on how you're going to perform in whatever environment that you are in or relationship that you are looking for. Now, Fredric, lastly, can you please tell us about the Golden Thread?
Golden Thread technology was created to bring genetics into the practical real world. And the mindset of Golden Thread is to make genetics understandable to everybody. And I got started on it, but we focus on a narrow area of reducing risks of injury to athletes, because globally, in the US alone, 6.5 million athletes a year suffer injuries requiring medical attention. That's an epidemic. Globally, it's close to 90 million athletes get hurt. This is huge. But the backstory is that my students from Johns Hopkins, because I've been an adjunct at Hopkins, I teach the business courses in biotechnology, which is creating the enterprise, economics, finance, whatever, 5 different courses. ethical, legal, regulatory issues. My students came to me and said, Dr. Abramson, you have to read this paper out of Stanford. They gave 14 triathletes their genetic data, and their injury rate went down 44%. And I went, oh, wow, that's a home run. That means it's actionable, going to the point we were talking about, right? I said, but there's a problem. They said, what's the problem? I said, they're from Stanford. I said, if you're from MIT, Stanford, or Caltech, you're used to understanding complex things. Everybody else in the world has to have science transformed into something that's understandable on their terms. And that's why I use the metaphor Google Maps. I want to be the Google Maps of genetics. Up until the 21st century, in order to get around the city that you didn't know, you had to go buy a map and figure out how to read it. And almost nobody knows how to read a map. Google said, why should you have to know how to read a map? All you have to do is be able to listen to instructions like turn left at the next light. And if you make a mistake, we'll figure it out, because we're not vested in whether you do it right. We're vested in getting you where you want to go. That's what genetics has to do. I want to create a model that says, I want to get you where you want to go on your terms. No one's done that before.
Well, that's a very interesting and profound analogy that you've given. And I look forward to going through to being the Google Maps of genetics.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Fredric, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge in genetics and frankly providing further scientific acknowledgement that by creating the right supportive environments, neurodivergence can thrive. It's been a very fascinating conversation and understanding towards genetics. And I'd like to thank you once again for being such an amazing guest.
Thank you. Can I add one more thing for the listeners?
Of course, please.
A great thing I learned at MIT, there are no embarrassing questions, only embarrassing answers. Anyone who's watching can feel free to reach out to me and ask me any question, anything, because I learn as I go, because no one's done this before. And I am on LinkedIn under Fredric Abramson. My email is F as in Frederick, D as in David, Abramson, ABRAMSON @goldenthreadtech.com. And I welcome comments, I welcome questions, because when you go down a path no one's gone down before, you got to pay attention to what everybody else is doing.
Well, thank you for your information. And as always, listeners, I will put Dr. Fredric's contact details into the show notes as our guest. Until next time, take a leap and transform.